Hello and welcome to this week's Draw, Paint and Print class. This week we're starting to take a little divergent trip away from pure just drawing and start to introduce some ideas to do with painting. I'm going to introduce you to some of the basic watercolour techniques as have been taught to me. I'm doing it on a half sheet of watercolour paper, roughly, and we're going to relate those exercises around the landscape and painting landscapes with the watercolours, namely because traditionally that's what watercolour was used for. It was used to paint the landscape. So if we think back to sort of early examples or early practitioners of it, when it really started to boom, particularly in England, it's where we do start to talk about names like Turner, probably first and foremost, Cotman, even Constable did have a little bit of a play with watercolour at times when doing studies out of doors. So it sort of does work hand in hand with working with the landscape. It's not to say, as I said, that you could be using some of these techniques with other genres as well. Watercolour in still life, portraiture, etc. is well recognised. To begin with, I'll talk to you about some of the materials and things that we want to use, and then we'll move on into the actual techniques. The first aspect we're going to deal with, looking here at watercolour, is preparing our paints. For these exercises, I'm just going to use 4 tubes. Yellow ochre, English red, or sometimes that's called light red oxide, and cobalt blue. I'm then going to pre-mix a colour using the light red and the cobalt blue. Because we're using the paints here in a studio circumstance, I want them to be at a consistency that they're ready to use, and quantities that I'm not constantly refilling my palette and that I have to break the concentration of the painting process by having to refill the palette. There's nothing worse. So what you can see here is I've got my dishes of colour that I have squeezed out of my tubes and added water to them so that they get to a creamy consistency. What I'm doing is I've put out quite a bit of the paint just here on the side, which I'm about to show you. And then using, and these are just a basic little hog bristle, so like an oil painting brush, but a very, very cheap one. You don't need to go and buy anything spectacular or have anything spectacular, just something with a stiff hair in it, and use these to massage that blob of paint into some water that you've added. Add the water with an atomizer. Now this is an atomizer that you can adjust the nozzle from by turning it from a squirt to a spray. So put it onto squirt, just a couple of controlled squirts into the dish, and then, as I said, massage that blob of paint gently into the water so that it doesn't have any lumps. So what I'm going to do, because as I said, this is a mix of the blue and the red, is that I'm just going to take that brush with blue on it and just mix that in. I've already sprayed a little bit of water in here just to reactivate the colour that I've got in here. Don't be afraid, you're not wasting any paint working in this method if you choose to, because it's all going in here. And as you know, possibly with watercolours, is that they dry out and that then you can just reconstitute them again. So I've added a blob of cobalt blue. I'm going to just put 1 spray at this stage of the water in there. And I'm tipping the dish slightly away from the blob and just slowly adding and pulling in and kneading that brush into the blob, just catching the edge of it and massaging it into the water. This is so that we don't have any lumps in it, because we don't want any lumps in the paint, because when you dip your brush into there whilst you're using it, you will, and you hit those lumps, you'll end up with lumps in your painting. So we just massage that blue right in. Now what we want to do is we're creating a mixed grey violet here when we mix these two. And without going into any great detail, we want to start with mainly cobalt blue in this mix, because the red we're using here is a very, 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 very strong red. And we're going to add a few dabs and a few drips of it like that, just little bit by little bit is the best way to go. And what you want to do is you just want to keep adding just a little bit of red until it makes sort of a grey violet-y colour. Now depending on the brand that you're using, sometimes this will be more violet than others, but if you add too much of this red, you're going to have to add a lot of blue to get it back to this mix. So that's why I just add a little bit of red and a little bit at a time. So there are the paints ready to go. The next aspect I want to talk to you about is your water containers. Have 3 containers and think about them like this. I have a jug here which is holding my well of water. I have a bucket and a sump. I will tip just a little bit of well water into my bucket because it's a small container, and this is the container that I do all my brush washing to change the colour. If I'm wanting to add a little bit of dirty colour to my mix, that's where I get that from. When that gets too saturated with colour, we tip it into the sump and then tip a little bit more water from our well into here, and it keeps this absolutely clean. You always have this ready for absolutely, if you need clean water, fresh water, you go into that, but you never wash in that bucket there, or the jug there I should say. I'm keeping this as simple as I can, so for most of these exercises I'm just going to be using a brush like this. This is an imitation brush, probably made from pony and ox. You don't need to be doing these exercises with your best sable, and sometimes these exercises are best achieved with a very basic brush. These brushes are a very basic brush. You're only looking at between $10 and $12 for these. You can do these exercises with better brushes, but in some regards these more simple brushes get better results. I'm going to be working on Arch 300 GSM cold pressed paper for these exercises. It is a paper that works the best for the removal techniques that I will show you, but if you don't have that, just use what you have, but preferably something with a cold pressed texture. This is roughly about, if you're using and thinking about full sheets of paper, this is about a half sheet, the size that I'm using here. What you can see I have done is that I have used Scotch magic tape, and I have taped around the edges of the paper like this. This is a block. If you don't have a block, you need to be taping the paper down onto a board slightly bigger than half a sheet of paper, and then I have divided it equally into 9 squares or rectangles like that, using the magic tape to separate them. The magic tape comes nicely off this paper without tearing it or causing any disturbance to the paper's surface. Depending on the paper that you're using, that Scotch tape might not work on other brands of watercolour paper. If you're finding that it is tearing the paper, you may need to use another type of magic tape, this one here, the removable magic tape, which comes in the blue box. And that's not quite as sticky as the Scotch magic tape, and you have more no tearing if you're using that paper with, or that tape with some papers. I'm using as a palette a large white tile. You could be just using an old white plate from the op shop or from home as a palette, but don't be putting your paints out onto a palette like that. If possible, try and put them into a separate dish. It means you're keeping these nice and clean and not getting muddy mixes. And it also means that this area here, you're creating a whole lot of interesting colours that you can be using in your work. The first exercise we're going to do are 2 different types of washes. I'm just going to get a piece of magic tape and just halve. Roughly by eye. When you're putting the magic tape down, just use the back of your thumb or fingernail and just lightly press the edges of it so that the watercolour doesn't sneak underneath of it. So you're going to do a flat wash and a graduated or variegated, not a variegated, a graduated wash or a graded wash is the first exercise. So the first wash we're going to do is a flat wash. I'm going to take with my brush here, I'm going to pick up some of the cobalt blue and put it out here and make a pool of the cobalt blue, diluted slightly with a little bit of water, till it's about that consistency that you can see. What I'm then going to do is making sure that I've got a slight angle to the board. It might be slightly difficult to see this. With a slight angle to the board, I'm going to make some passes over this half of this rectangle. So I'm just going to I'm going to start on the tape and work across and finish on the tape on that side. You'll see it's creating a pool of colour along the bottom. We then take some more paint from that pool that I've created and use just the tip of the brush to touch that pooling on that first stroke. Again, load the brush, touch the tip, pull the colour across. And just keep working backwards and forwards like that, loading in between each mark that you make. Wash the brush out, dampen it, or just dry it off slightly I should say, and then just across that bottom pick up that excess pool of colour. And there's the first wash. That's a flat wash. You'll notice there's a couple of sparkles in mine. That's where I was working maybe a little bit too quick across the paper. And so it has, the brush hasn't had time to get down into the texture, but that's okay. Sometimes that can be useful in terms of enlivening a flat wash, making that flat wash not so boring. The next one we're going to do is a graded wash. So the same again, I'm just going to make that a little bit stronger. Not much though. And again, lifting up the paper onto an angle, roughly about 45. And we're going to do starting on the tape, we're going to move our way across with one stroke like that. Very quickly wash the brush out into from fresh water. So this is then just a clean brush, no pigment in it, and do a sweep across like so. Clean the brush again, fresh water, and picking up that pool of colour, doing another sweep like that. I'm working a bit too slow, so I've got a bit of a line there. And again, picking up the colour, sweeping across with fresh water. And again, fresh water. And again, fresh water. Dry it out, pick up the pool, and just wipe those edges a little bit cleaner. So that's a flat wash and a graduated or graded wash where the colour is strong out to weak. The next exercise we're going to do is another type of wash, and we're going to work with it in two different ways. We're going to halve up our rectangle like that, and in this first one we're going to use a little bit of all the colours that we've got, and we're going to just work on dry paper to begin with. So we're going to pick up just a little bit of yellow and pull it out into an area like that, and we're going to do a variegated wash with a reserve. So from one corner, just wipe it around like that, clean out your brush, pick up a little bit of red, wet it out, and then just touching that edge, bring it around that quarter of the paper. And the next one is again, wet the brush, pick up some of this mixed grey, and work around this quarter. And in the last bit, leaving this area in the middle without any paint, of course. And then in the last bit, working with the cobalt blue, just touching the edge and then just touching the edge of the yellow. And so that's a variegated wash, or a very easy and simple way of doing a variegated wash, by just touching each of the colours as we move around. What I'm going to be doing throughout these is I am going to be using a hairdryer. I'm going to be using a hairdryer to very quickly speed up the drying time of these. What you want to do when you're doing it with a hairdryer is keep the hairdryer moving quite rapidly. And what you're looking for is the paper to settle down flat again without any ripples. That means it's well and truly dry right through the paper. If you just do it a little bit, the top surface will be dry, underneath will still be wet, and that water will travel back up to the top and make it go ripply and cause problems for you if you're then working over the top. In the other half here, I'm just going to use a hake, this type of brush is, or you could just with any large brush, even the brush that you are using for the painting, the round, is I'm just going to wet that. Now I'm not wetting it to the point that it's had an absolute bath, it's just a gentle saturation over the top, and I'm not working the water in too much because you start to fluff up the paper. And we're going to do exactly the same thing. Work a variegated around, but this time we're working with it wet in wet. So I'm going to start with the yellow again. And working in, and we're trying to maintain a reserve of white in the middle. And finally, the blue. Now, the longer you leave this just sitting without hair drying it, the more the paint will travel inwards and in other directions and tighten up that reserve of white in the middle. In this rectangle here, we're going to divide that in half again, and we're going to take our brush and we're going to make 2 marks, or a few marks, across the panel, one half of this panel. And this is a dry brush effect. So our dry brushing was when we're working on dry paper with water and colour in the brush. Different effects will happen depending on the way we move and the way we drag. If we drag very lightly and very slowly, we're going to get a good solid line or mark on the paper, as opposed to if we work very quickly across the paper. Here we're getting that more sparkle because the brush doesn't have time to push paint down into the paper surface, this rough paper surface. Again, if we work on the very side of the brush, maybe pulling it right down, need to load it first, and again working very slowly, we're getting a different kind of mark again there too. It's pulling and doing different things. And again, if we move quickly on the side of the brush, we get a different type of mark as well. What I want you to then do is exactly the same thing, but we're going to wet the brush, or wet this paper I should say, and work in exactly the same way. So we want to work slowly, fast, slowly on the side, fast on the side, and then dry. In this panel here, we're now going to combine some of our techniques that we've just learned and paint a landscape. Make sure your water's nice and refreshed, ready to go. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to take a yellow and very, very palely. So make the colour pale, so plenty of water and just a little bit of pigment. So something like that. And we're going to lift, might go with a bit more water actually, make a bit more of a pool. And a bit more stronger. And we're going to do just a flat wash of yellow ochre across this. Right across the rectangle, from top to bottom. dry the brush, pick up that excess, clean it, dry. Make sure it's thoroughly dry before you do the next stage. That's when you're going to work into some blue. Make sure it's about sort of that kind of strength. And think about some mountain type shapes. Tilt the board ever so slightly. And then do a variegated wash. So fresh clean water and stroke across that. Just tickle some of those out a bit. Fresh clean water again. Fresh clean water again. And one last stroke of fresh clean water. Dry. Pick up that last. And then the last thing we're going to do is that we're going to do a variegated wash across that foreground. We're going to start maybe with that dark violety colour and make sure this is nice and strong. Into the blue. I might go for a change. Into the yellow. And finally, the red. Whilst that's still wet, one of those bristle brushes that you used for mixing before could be quite useful. And just have a go if you just use the very tips and do some dragging. Break that edge slightly, creating sort of a grassy feel, and then dry. The last little bit of this exercise of this square, we're going to do just a little trick. We're going to take a piece of tape and thinking roughly where a horizon could be, not wide enough. Thinking where a horizon could be, we're going to put the tape above the horizon. So the bottom of the piece of tape is sitting where you'd think your imaginary horizon might be, like so. Make sure the paper is well and truly dry, and just gently push down one edge of the paper, of the tape I should say, with a nice clean brush and a tissue on hand, just along the edge of that tape. Just tickle with the tip of the brush and then wipe. When you're wiping like this, make sure you quickly and twist the tissue as you're doing it so that you've got a nice clean fresh piece of tissue at every point. Now we're going to leave that. and then take your tape up. And you've created a nice crisp horizon line there. And so we've got a body of water, or the feeling, or the beginnings of a start of a body of water, with a evening sort of sunset thing happening going on there. Beautiful. This next one, we're going to divide it into half again, and we're going to do two new techniques here. We're going to do what we call mingling and charging. So to do a mingle is where we place an area of one colour down, like so, and where we then introduce a second colour, and we just gently come up and touch that edge of that first colour with the second colour, so that the two colours just merge ever so slightly. Again, the longer you leave it, or the wetter you use it, the more it will mingle. In this next one, we're going to make sure that the first thing that we put down is quite wet, so we're going to do a yellow wash, or just a rough flat wash. Where we just move the watercolour around like so. Clean the brush, and into that we're going to charge it. So this is where, whilst it's very wet, we drop in colour in however way we want it. And again, the quicker, the slower you touch it, will create different types of charged marks. Again, the longer you leave it, the more they will blend and merge and change. In this rectangle, we're going to combine some of these techniques. So make sure again that you start with nice fresh paint, or fresh water I should say. Of course we've got fresh paint. And what we're going to do is we're going to do a wet in wet sky. So again, we're going to wet the paper like so, and we're going to first charge it, leaving in reserve. So we're charging like we have it, rather than charging into a colour, we're charging into water, and we're thinking about leaving some reserve white. whilst that's still drying, we might just touch it and charge it with some other colour. Still leaving some areas reserved white, but just some small areas in this case. When you're happy with your paper's nice and dry, is again get a piece of tape and tape down below where you would like to maybe see a horizon. Then with a piece, a little bit of the light, the violety grey, what I want you to do is paint a mountainy sort of shape, but then start to variegate and lighten that up. So I've just added a little bit of water, and then another little bit of water, and we might just add a little bit of strength in on this side, like that, very nicely. And then dry that before you remove the tape. When you've got that nice and dry, you're going to just gently lift the tape up and reuse that same piece of tape, and you're going to go over the landmass that you've just created and just below it, so that you're creating a very fine, thin line that the paint won't get onto. Like that. With some blue, we're going to do some marks like we did here, those quick skipping across the surface. This is nice and dry, and we're going to just go swing, getting that sparkly look like that, and dry that, and then with a loaded brush of the violet, we're going to come in from this side, thinking about creating a landform across here, and then into that, right into the pool of fresh colour like that, is let's think about charging some of this. So into it with quite solid colour, like so. And then dry. Escaped a couple of times there under the tape. That's where I didn't tape it down very well. And also too, where I wasn't careful with my drying. You can see here I've pushed the paint this way. But these things happen and can lead you off into other directions. So say for instance, this then has the shadow that look as though there might be some shadows there of some trees, and then maybe we can start to do something like that. It starts to change and fix any of those mistakes that might happen. This next exercise is probably one of the most important ones, because so far we've looked at all different ways of applying the paint. In this next exercise we're going to look at ways of lifting the paint. Now this is where it's important to make note of that all the colours that we're using colours that we call granulating colours, and that means these colours are colours that stay on the surface. If you try and do some of these techniques that we're about to do with some colours, and namely the staining colours, and they're colours like phthalos, some of your magentas, some of those really actually very bright colours, they get into the paper and they're very difficult to move. And some of these techniques just won't work with those. So be aware, to begin to learn to use these techniques, I think it's best to start with the colours that are granulating, or colours that you can granulate. So what I'm going to start with first is that I'm going to just lay down a wash just roughly across the page like so, with a pair of that, making sure it's relatively heavy with colour and thick like that too. I'll just make it a little heavier. So this is about the paper. I'm not going to be drying the paper as I go. The paper is going to just naturally dry. And so we're going to be doing certain lifting techniques as it dries. The first one we're going to do is just using a tissue. So using a scrunched up tissue like that. You could also do this with a sponge too. Might give a different effect, in which we might try that too. So I'm just going to wet the sponge so it's ready to go. But we'll start with a tissue. So a crumpled up tissue like that. So don't necessarily put it down flat. Put it down in a sort of a crumpled fashion. We'll lift very quickly colour off, and you'll get quite dramatic effects like that. Probably with a sponge it will be a little bit more gentle and softer edged like that. So you can see two different types of lifting there with similar things. We then want to move on and use a brush. Now if you wet your brush, slightly dampen it so that there's not as much moisture in it, and it's very similar to what we did in this box here, and that we're just going to further lift some areas of colour out. Like so. The next and the other way that we can lift colour is while the paper is still wet here. I'm going to use a blade, and we're going to scratch into it like that. And you can see that pushes the paint away very quickly, and you get these interesting edges to it like that. The next way that we're going to remove paint is with the atomizer. This is where you put it onto the squirt which I shall eventually get there. Yes, we will. And either do it over a sink or with plenty of cloths handy. Yeah, we might just let it go off in that direction. And we're going to use the water to direct the spray away in a certain direction. Actually, I'm going to do it like this. So I'm bringing the nozzle down quite close. I'm thinking that the gravity, which way I want the water to flow away from me. So I'm going in that direction. And again, it's one of those things is you can see quite quickly. I could then leave it and let it settle. And we might just let that settle. What you can do is wipe into that and it will take off quite a lot of paint. But sometimes it's nice just to let it spray. What will happen is whilst that area here in the centre is really quite damp, is the colour will start to soak back towards it. The next exercise we're going to do is whilst that's now, this is starting to dry, these areas. So they're much, much drier than they were when we were using the tissue over here. So you can start to, when it's drier, do what we call a hard wipe. And that's similar to what I was describing earlier, where we will twist the cloth or the tissue very gently, like that. Oh, we're losing. And creating these type of wiped effects like that. It's probably still a little damp than what I would like, but I might just put a little bit of air to speed it up. It's going a bit slow. The next one we're going to do, we might just wipe that again actually before we to see that hard wipe. Well, actually, oh, that's nice. There's another one. You then need to thoroughly dry, so we are going to thoroughly. We're then going to do a similar technique to what we did earlier. I think we're going to put it about, and we're going to put 2 pieces of tape down, leaving a small gap between the 2. Like that. Make sure to press down the edges of those 2 pieces of tape so no water can get underneath. And again, with a nice clean brush, we're going to just tickle the paint in between there and activate the colour. And then very quickly with a cloth wipe like that. And then remove the pieces of tape. And so you'll get a beautiful, crisp, white line once you get all the tape off. There we go. The next, when the paper is well and truly dry like it is here, you can also, this is a stage that you would be using blades and things like that to scratch into it. So just with a razor blade like this, we can do 2 types of scratching. We can do a scratching against the ruler, like that, creating sort of a very sharp edge with a rusty sort of line underneath, or a rough line underneath. Or we can just free scratch like this. And depending on how much of the blade we have on the paper, we can get different effects like that. The last version that we can do is it can be using the tape and placing it down and drawing a shape onto that to give you a guide. Like so. And then with a sharp blade again, so either a razor blade or an X-Acto type knife, which I'm going to use, we'll cut that shape out. And peel that out in the middle. Revealing, make sure it's nicely wiped down, revealing the paint underneath, and again wet that and wipe. Take that tape up and we've got a nice clean white dot like that. The next part that I want to talk to you about is the idea of that I did introduce into that video a few weeks ago when I was outdoors sketching, that dot, dab, drag and roll with a single brush. So we're just going to have a bit of a play and further explore that idea. So remembering that it was dots, and depending on how much pressure you put on, you get different marks. Dabs, which were on the side of the brush like that. Drags, which is dragging the brush like this, which we've sort of done previously in those wet and dry. And that idea of rolling the brush, creating, whoops, more paint, rolling the brush, creating different marks like that, which wasn't terribly successful. We can be doing those same things with our other brushes. So like the brushes that we were using for mixing before to get the paints going, just those cheap hog hair bristle brushes. Again, the same thing is that they can make interesting dots, dabs, drags and rolls. That's a slightly better roll. But also that we can be making beautiful possibly tree shapes and things like that. So if we're thinking about using them maybe for making tree shapes in a landscape, is that idea of pushing with the brush like that creates a much different quality of mark than if we try and paint a tree shape. So pushing that around, and two, by combining movements. So we're painting a massed tree and joining it to the ground with a sweep across like so. And it becomes, rather than two separate parts, part of the whole, connected. You can then, into marks like these, scratch back into them to create branches and areas like that, or lift out lights and things out of them too if you do them dark enough. In this space here, we're going to now combine some of these removal techniques with what we've done previously. So what I want you to do first is do a wet in wet environment or tonal sky. So we might start with, we'll start with that brush, and we're going to just wet that down. Like so. And we're then going to come in there with some cobalt blue. Yes, we're going to come in there with some cobalt blue. Thinking about leaving some reserve. Thinking about where maybe a position of the horizon could be. Whilst I'm doing this. So maybe try and make sure you're reflecting, repeating some of the similar marks that you're doing as what you do above that imaginary horizon, do them and below the imaginary horizon. I might just come in with some of this colour too into that. So, and then we're going to dry. The next thing that you will do is do similar to what we did in this one, a nice graduated mountain with just a very pale, begin stronger but a pale wash, but we're going to do a graduated wash. Start with some stronger colour first. And we're sort of thinking a graduated wash from strong to light across this way. So we're going to sort of paint in. And again, I'm thinking where my horizon is and thinking of painting above and below the horizon, that mountain. So there's like a reflection. Into that now, we're going to just pull, and I might just tip the board slightly like that. Oops. And as I said, thinking about what's below as being above. Like so. And then dry that. Now with some stronger colour, we might just start with some straight cobalt blue in this case. With some stronger colour, we're going to come in here on this side and start to indicate a landmass here in the foreground, and then we're going to charge that with some other stronger colour. Like so. And then dry. Sometimes whilst that's drying, and now there's some areas there that are dry and other areas that are not, you can come back in and wipe, and you will get some lovely sparkly type effects by doing that. From our lifting techniques before, we're going to take 2 pieces of tape, thinking about where a horizon line would be, leaving a fine gap between the 2 pieces of tape. Like so. Clean water. And activate this end. Try and push some of that activated paint that way. Really activate and push it that way. And then just wipe half, like so. And then dry before you lift it. Then with one of the brushes that we've used for mixing colour, you can come in there and introduce tree shape, pushing branches up, like so. Maybe then with our round brush, using just the very tip. Dance in something like that, and then into this, like we did here, remove some lights with some scratches, like so. So there you go. There's some of the basic principles and techniques of watercolour, and how you could be applying them to the landscape. These are also techniques that you could be using for other genres as well. It's always very exciting when you then pull off all the tape and have these nice clean edges to your shape, to your work, and it looks, I think, much better once you've taken the tape off. Have a go of those. If you have any questions, please just shoot me an email. I would recommend, as I said at the beginning, to watch each part and do each part, rather than try and watch the whole video and then repeat the whole thing. Do that first, rectangle, second rectangle, third rectangle, etc. And then go on and maybe draw up another set of rectangles, or tape up another set of rectangles like this, and repeat particularly some of these more final landscape where you're combining some of these techniques. And as I said to begin with, don't try and be drawing any or painting any particular landscape. Just use your imagination. There's no right or wrongs. This is getting used to the techniques of what you can do with watercolour. Good luck, and I look forward to seeing what you've done when we meet up in Zoom.